Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you from wherever you're joining us. I'm really excited to have you with us today. My name is Musulayode. I'm the Executive Director at African Philanthropy Forum, and this is the third in our series of virtual convenings that are focused on organizations that are this intersection of gender justice and digital technology. Today's topic, as you all know and as you have seen, is best practices for funding NGOs at the intersection of digital technology and gender justice. We're really excited to have you here. I'm personally looking forward to learning from our amazing panel that we have with us today, and you'll be meeting shortly. As I mentioned, this is the third in a series, and the main focus of the series of conversations is for the African Philanthropy Forum Network to become more, to get more awareness and have more knowledge around the issues at the intersection of gender justice and digital technology, and to get a better understanding in the space in a way that they are able to support the nonprofit organizations that are working in this space. So we're really honored that you're joining us. I know some of you have come for all of the sessions, so thank you. If you're joining for the very first time, welcome, and we're looking forward to having you join future sessions as well. So I'll just go ahead and hand this over to our moderator for today, who is Temitope Ogundipe, and she's the Executive Director of Tech Social. Did I get that right? Tech Social?
Tech Societal.
Sorry, Tech Societal. Welcome, Temitope.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Musu. Thank you, everyone who has joined today. We really hope that this conversation will be very useful to your work. And we are going to jump right in without wasting the little time that we have, because I can assure you that there's a lot to talk about and a lot to learn from one another. So I will just give floor to the panel. I'm just the moderator. I'm the person asking questions. I do the easy job. I will give floor to the experts around funding today to introduce themselves. They're going to tell you what they do, what organization they are from, what excites them the most about funding, in this space, funding feminist movements, funding organizations working at the intersection of gender justice and digital access. And then we will pick up the conversation from there. So I'm going to begin with Chennai today. Chennai, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tope. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are. My name is Chinaiche, and I'm the Senior Program Officer at Mozilla Foundation, leading our Africa Innovation Muradi, as well as the Common Voice East African Languages open source project. What excites me today, as my background as someone who's been working as a feminist in digital technology, is really the hope that comes when people are intentional around funding gender and digital justice work, particularly led by feminists, as well as the imagination that stems from this kind of funding. Some of the interventions that we've seen as a result of the funding are beyond the usual of let's build a chatbot, but they're actually kind of like an ecosystem intervention that sees a shift in the way that tech can be used to further address social justice issues, and at the same time to hold people accountable who are actually making use of technology as an intervention to social justice issues. Thanks. Handing it back to you, Tope.
Thank you, Chennai. Jessica.
Hi, greetings to everybody. So my name is Jessica Horn, and I'm the Regional Director for the Ford Foundation in East Africa. We cover Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and we have a mandate around defending and promoting civic space, which includes digital civic space. The Ford Foundation also has a tech and society program that funds within the US and globally around expanding the possibility of an internet and digital space in the public interest. What excites me on gender and tech is the fact that the digital ecosystem and digital thinking is still nascent. I mean, it's all pretty new in terms of its interface, in particular with citizens, but feminism isn't. And actually, there is really solid analysis, there's solid vision, there's solid thinking, and there's solid understanding about what we need to do in the world to make it gender just and therefore just for everyone. And so I'm excited about the fact that if we lean into and resource and pay attention to and make central the work that feminists have been doing, we will actually be able to tackle a lot of the issues around how we expand digital good and minimize digital harm in the world.
Great, thank you, Jessica. I'll pass it on to Caroline.
Awesome, thank you so much, Tope. Hi everyone, calling in from Nairobi. My name is Caroline Teti. I work at Give Directly as the Director of Advocacy and Safeguarding. Give Directly, if you may not have known about it, this is an organization that sends unconditional cash to people living in extreme poverty. Our main platform are mobile phones. So mobile money is a huge technology for us in terms of how we can reach people. What excites me about this session? One is the fact that it is a session that is talking about Africa for Africa and Africa for women, but also that, you know, there is so much gain that has been made in terms of the feminist movement, empowering women, but also a lot has been eroded because of, you know, inaction and lack of responses. And I'm imagining just how much more harm can be done if we don't think about women and technology today, because the world is becoming very small. Women still remain critical, and none of us can challenge that when we have women at the center of decision making for transformation of the communities that we work in, that we transform whole communities. And if the future is digital and the future is technology, then leaving women behind is a really, really big disservice to this to the world. And for that matter, I think for me today, getting us all together to talk about where are the women? Are they with us or are they left out and left behind? So looking forward to chatting with all of us.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. I realized that I didn't say anything about what Tech Societal does. You know, so Tech Societal is a nonprofit. We are focused on reducing digital inequalities and digital harms, and we do that by advancing safety and rights for women and girls online. And more recently, we're also looking at children, younger girls and children. So just to quickly jump in, based on the things that excite the speakers today, I think it was Jessica that mentioned how there's always been traditional feminist movements, and we need to be thinking about how we resource those movements, how we empower those movements to be able to now begin to work in the digital sphere or digital space to advance the rights that they've always advanced in traditional physical spaces. But I'm not asking Jessica this question. I'm going to start with Chennai to ask you how you have, in your work, you have been able to organize around mainstreaming funding and support for these organizations that are leading at the intersection of gender justice and digital rights. And I may be asking all of you that in one way or other, but I'd like to start with Chennai on that question.
Thank you, Tope. So to respond to that question, I'm going to respond as Mozilla Foundation. Our work really has been responding to the reality that if you want to build something that is going to be responsive to society, and as part of our ethos around movement building, which is building leadership and capacity of people who are already doing the work around social justice, it's important for us to respond to the gendered realities in the global majority. So for us, our ethos of work has really been around the intentionality of how we fund. So making sure that we create we have low barrier funding where people are trying to put in an application that it's not, you know, like send us 10,000 documents, but actually it allows for us to be able to have an easy access for people to put in an application for funding. We recently had our in real life funds focused on East and Southern Africa, where we've been successful enough to actually fund also in contentious issues such as queer movement work, where we've seen a lot of like pullback anti-rights movements where people who are organizing around queer work are getting arrested. And these are often feminist organizations who are also working around online safety. So that has been around an issue of intentionality for us. we've also really been community-centric in how we fund organizations and individuals working at the intersection of gender and digital justice. And this is really in terms of us making sure that we provide accompaniment strategies when people are getting access to funding, so that it's not just you getting a grant to do the work, but for us to actually leverage our position as Mozilla to connect people to different intersectional points, to different resources. We, for example, supported a gender-based violence app in South Africa called Kwanele, by firstly putting them through what we call a working group called Trustworthy AI, because the challenge around building technology is sometimes people are excited to build something, but they don't think about the harms that can occur when you build technology for such sensitive or dangerous issues, where sometimes you might actually leave people more exposed or more at risk based on what you've built up. And they were actually fortunate enough to win our responsible AI challenge to the tune of $30,000 as a result of us actually, going through that process and being part of the Mozilla community as well. And then another thing that guides our work is really thinking about the people who are at Mozilla Foundation, because who we are mirrors the kind of work that we want to do. And I think one of the remarks I've often said is that at this current moment, gender and digital justice work, feminist work is kind of exciting and it's sexy, and a government institution such as, I think, Germany quite recently released a feminist policy. The Canadian government has often had a feminist policy. So people are responding to the feminist call, but not necessarily being feminist in their practice, or being people who are considerate of what are the power dynamics that exist when you're a funder, what are the issues around other barriers that may exist when, like when you're a funder and funding an NGO organization or individuals. So for us, the people who are actually part of doing the work at Mozilla are people who are aware of their own dynamics and are committed to shifting the current status quo in the way in which feminist organizations or organizations that work on gender and digital justice are often funded, which is a top-down driven approach. Yet our approach is more kind of like listening to what it is that is needed by these organizations and meeting them where they are with the resources that we have. Thanks, Tope.
Thank you so much, Shonai. That's a lot that I'm coming back to. I'm going to come back to that because you mentioned some really important things about how the movement is gaining more attention, but the practices around funding and resourcing are not necessarily yet bottom up or democratized, or they're not necessarily those practices that allow the funding and the resources to go to the organizations and communities that need them the most. And that's something that I'm coming back to. I'm coming back to talk to you about those low barrier funding practices that you talked about. But I just wanted to quickly ask Caroline, because you work with this organization that from the little I've learned, you give directly, just as the name says, and you're working with some of the most marginalized groups that are least likely to access and use digital technologies. And you mentioned that you are reaching them through devices, mobile technology devices and other digital means that you're using to empower and give resources to these women. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts about addressing these issues of access to digital technologies for those who are least likely to adopt, for those who are marginalized. I mean, COVID-19 just really showed, how much these technologies are being relied on for literally every aspect of life now. Yet we have, in rural communities, a lot of women and girls and are still offline. But you mentioned that this is the primary means by which you also reach these people. So I think that there's something innovative we can learn from there about resourcing access, especially to connectivity and to devices for women and girls who are living in the most marginalized circumstances or communities. So I wanted you to just speak to your experience around that.
Beautiful. Yeah, and thanks so much. I think our focus, if you think about Give Directly and the work that we're doing, is we're trying to bridge the gap of the policies that exist around digitization of access, especially for women, to actual practice by doing last mile interventions, making sure that those who are, those unreachable populations can actually access some of these services. And you will agree with me that even if we started speaking today until Kingdom Come, women who are living in those deep rural villages will remain unreached. Someone has to take the first step to find them where they are and give them that access and empower them and let them know what that access means. That is exactly what we have done, which is basically accessing communities that were previously considered unreachable or inaccessible, and getting to them, and one, distributing mobile phones to them, and two, helping them understand the value that there is in using the mobile phone, three, helping them access mobile money accounts, and then enabling them to engage with those mobile money accounts. So basically what we are doing is, one, we are increasing access by providing them with mobile technology. And then we are helping them with the knowledge to help them connect with those technologies in their hands. Then we are giving them reason to use that technology, which is sending money through mobile money into those same technologies. In that way, we are giving decisions into their hands and choices into their hands. As I had said, the transfers that we are sending to communities is unconditional, which means the people who are receiving these transfers get to decide what they need to do with the money, which is not what is done in our everyday, aid interventions. A lot of people, when we started this work 13 years ago, lots of people asked, why should you just give people money? Poor people are not able to make good decisions. They're going to drink all that money and they're going to smoke it all away. And right now we have 20 randomized control trials that show that that is actually not true, that poor people actually can make very, very sound decisions when money is put in their hands. And when you open that space by providing mobile phones, you're not just giving them money. You're doing financial inclusion, you're empowering them to make decisions, and you're also giving them an opportunity to start interacting with some of the things that China is just talking about: confidentiality, privacy, data protection, safeguarding themselves. Those all come by the time, because you can't talk to a woman who doesn't have access to technology on how to protect themselves. But the moment you give them access, you start opening their brains and their minds around why this is an important tool and how it can actually impact their lives, both positively and negatively. And now I'm going to give you, an example of one country that really struck me. In Mozambique, there is a location towards the northern part of Mozambique next to a national park called Gorongosa. Now, that community is one that is very, very close to the militia groups. People fear getting there. So you can imagine that if people fear getting into your community because of insecurity, it's very likely that nobody will ever reach you. So we went to the buffer zone of the national park, and the intention was to send money to families living around the buffer zone for 3 years, monthly transfers to help them, build resilience, improve nutrition, agriculture, etc., etc. When I went back early this year and met women from this community, and I was waiting for them to tell me how nutrition has improved, health has improved, the first thing they told me is, we have seen revolution by the phones that you have given to us. And the reason that is revolutionary is because, number one, it has brought us together as a community. We can communicate with each other very easily. Number two, it has improved our response to different issues. I can respond to my child's illness when I am out in the fields. I can speak to my health provider in the facility, and just because I have a phone in my hands. But most important, that for the first time, women in this community have had the opportunity not just to own phones, but to also participate in transacting using the phones, something they only saw in the men. So when we are talking about inclusion, digital participation by women, there is no reality that you will get until you get to those women we are classifying as vulnerable, unreachable, and I would say neglected. I would say they are neglected, but there are opportunities. And I can tell you that when they are given that opportunity, they are ready to learn, and communities have ways in which they will adopt those technologies. And even those who had never used them will find ways in which they will start understanding how to integrate local knowledge, the learning of how to use that technology amongst them.
C'est une...
Back to you,
Ouais,
Tope.
bah oui, parce que il serait
Please
plus...
don't Caroline. We have an interference. There's someone who's speaking. If everyone else could mute.
Tope, I think you were also muted. If you can put your mic on.
Okay, I muted myself while trying to tell someone else to be muted. Thank you so much. I can see everyone introducing themselves in the chat room. Please keep doing that. Thank you so much. People are joining from East Africa, from Southern Africa, from West Africa, from even the US and the UK. So thank you everyone for joining. I would like to ask Jessica this next question about, given your experience, especially funding or trying to, to empower to ensure that the civic space remains open, I think particularly in East Africa, what would you say are the key factors that you consider when it comes to funding? And I know that this depends a lot on individual mandates of funding organizations. Of course, the funding proposal, or you would give consideration to asks that are around what your strategy is, and that's a given, and that's really difficult to and that what I mean is there are a lot of organizations here that work on a lot of different issues, but I just wanted to speak to that broadly in terms of if an organization, and also you can draw from your experience, your governance experience working with different funding organizations, what are the factors that are key to consider apart from that fit with strategy, whether that is in agriculture, digital technologies, climate change, health, there could be different things. But what makes you consider that this organization or this movement, is worth funding or resourcing broadly?
Sure. I mean, I feel like that's a hard question to answer. Maybe I just have to answer it generically, and then I'd like to segue in that. I mean, any donor has a mandate. And I think if you're a grant seeker, you just really need to see whether or not your mandate intersects. I think there's a lot of disappointment that often happens because people are approaching donors with a mandate that doesn't fit. And, so that is what it is. But again, I think you just have to be, just do your research. And then, different donors have different criteria. For some donors, the demography that you're working with matters. For some, it's the location. For some, it's your registration status. So you just have to make sure, like I said, that it's a good match and you've done your homework. And then also in general, just in terms of approaching donors are people. And so that kind of approach that can sometimes be filled with a lot of tension isn't always the most productive. They always say, the best approach to fundraising is friend-raising. And if you can have just a smart conversation with people, donors are here to fund work that's going to make change, and so it's best to actually put forward your vision for change, and to have a conversation, because we should work towards being equals. We're in an ecosystem, we all need each other, actually. And so we should work towards being equals. But in general, I mean, I think one of the things that Caroline raised when she was talking about, the impact of a mobile phone in a small community in Mozambique and how it changed their lives, is that the interesting thing about the power of tech is that it has a power to make new worlds. And so this is why it's so critical for us as donors, regardless of what we're funding on, to pay attention. Because, tech is shaping our worlds in ways, in some respects, that we didn't imagine, because we literally didn't imagine it. The majority of technology that's out in the public domain is owned by companies. So it's primarily commercial space that we engage and interact with. And the majority of tech, in terms of the largest companies, as we know, come from the imaginations of a very small demographic of the world. Right? They're mainly relatively privileged white men. Not all Americans, because of course we have the Elon Musks, etc., or South Africans, but it's a particular demographic that doesn't actually really reflect our imaginations, right? If you're a woman in rural Mozambique, if you're a digital tech sister in Harare, right, you don't necessarily share the imagination. So for us, I mean, the Food Foundation has had for a very long time a principle of in our regional offices primarily funding work that is driven by people in the region, because the idea has always been to invest in the leadership and innovation and vision of the region. That's what's going to transform the region. People are also in it for the long term because it's their place, it's their country, it's their community, it's they have a vested interest in the transformation, and we believe it's important to resource that. And that's interesting. And again, when it comes to gender in tech, one of the things we see is that the tech space had primarily also been dominated by men in general. But what I find interesting about a lot of the feminist thinking on tech is that it's opening up all of the questions, again, we should have been thinking about, right? Even in the activist tech space. And being able to link the very private personal impacts of tech all the way through to the governance, and sort of larger public policy implications of technology. And so for me, I think it's really critical that we look at where the conversations are happening and we look at where the innovation is happening. The last thing I would say is this: the tech is global. And so I also feel like transnational work is critical here. We know, for example, in the conversation about AI, it's now a big public conversation in the media, etc. But who were some of the early people calling out concerns around the ethical, the ethical frameworks within which AI was being developed? In the States, which is again sort of one of the largest tech, markets, it was Black women, right? And with like really rigorous, consideration and raising some of the concerns of the things that we're seeing now. So again, I think we would be wise to pay more attention to some of these voices that we've marginalized in the ways that we work. Because again, if we're trying to build, a digital space that works for everyone in the world, it actually has to represent the needs and aspirations of a majority. And at the moment, it's still very much privileging a minority in terms of a vision. And so I really think as donors, again, we need to continue to look at ways that we can actually ensure that the kind of visions and imagination and analysis of a majority, it is what's being reflected in the ways that we're investing in resourcing this field.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that brilliant answer. The reason why I asked that question very broadly, and even though we're here talking about gender justice and digital technologies, and I was talking about organizations that work in climate and agriculture, is just that fact that we had established previously that there are traditional human rights and women's rights movements that are not yet in these spaces, but they have the voice, they have the tools, they can drive the change if they are resourced and informed to do so. And when we have these conversations, we can be in our own little echo chamber and the usual suspects come together, and people don't know to broaden their horizon and look in unlikely places and think of innovative ways, to collaborate and work with one another in order to advance some of these issues. The women in the community organizers and the organizations, for instance, that Caroline worked with, they are not going to be traditional nonprofit leaders. They are going to be women farmers. They are going to be, those kinds of people. But we need to be including those kind of voices in this space and resourcing those kind of organizations, which brings me back to you, Chanai, to talk about those low funding, those low barrier funding initiatives that you talked about, and what those look like in practice. What does this bottom-up approach look like in practice? And how does it work for some of the smaller organizations, individual voices in marginalized communities who are organizing, who are doing the work, at that intersection of gender justice and digital technologies, but they are not yet as resourced, they are not yet as big, and they really need to break through these barriers to be able to access these resources and expand their work.
Thanks, Tope. So I think as Jessica was speaking and highlighted the building a friendship with program officers, I think that was it. But you had a much more beautiful term for it, if I'm not mistaken. And I think for me, one of the things around it being a low barrier to entry is really cultivating relationships with people in different spaces and networking. Because I think half the time, my understanding, and this is something as Mozilla that we're trying to build up right now, is program officers have access to resources, but sometimes they aren't aware of the initiatives and the usual suspects, because I love the way that you phrased the usual suspects, are usually people who are inhabit spaces and are confident enough to ask, is there an opportunity of funding? How can we build it up? If there isn't a consistent fund call, or you find in some instances when there is a grant call that does go out, people who are confident, or I wouldn't say confident in applying, but who can figure out how to game the system, actually end up applying. But the people who have the opportunities, particularly feminists who are already doing this work, who can lead the change, are not applying because I think there is this concern around, like, how does my work fit into all of this as an opportunity? So one of the things that, when you think about low barriers to entry, one of the things that we've taken on as Mozilla is to really build up awareness on the opportunities that can arise in these spaces. How do you have access to funding? And this is what we call sort of like an accompaniment strategy, which is like bringing people into different networks and opportunities and leveraging who we are as Mozilla to speak to different funders. So I'm just a shameless plug here. We have the MOSFEST House Kenya that's happening in September, and in Nairobi, 21 to 22 September, and it's free. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in actually coming to learn around the work of Mozilla and actually meet other funders in that space to participate and attend what we have what we call a funders trek, where we ask funders to actually share the opportunities that they have, how people can connect with them, and how people can actually build up those relationships that at one time, if you do miss this funding call, you can actually also apply for another initiative. And then secondly, for us at Mozilla, we also think around like the amounts that we're going to give people. So if we're going to give you $50,000, that is going to come with an expectation of larger reporting requirements. And that for us is something that we build up with a relationship with a potential awardee to actually say, look, we need you to have a financial officer in place. Is that something that you have? And then we think about it as a core funding, which is like basically money that you can then build up to do the work that you need, or it's going to be project funding. But this is all, again, up to you as the person who's coming in. And then for the smaller grants that we have, we really try to make sure that we're not asking you to submit a 10-page proposal for something that there's going to be a 180 pool of applicants, and then at the end of the day, only 6 people are going to get the grant. So for us, it's that really that consideration of the amount of time that people are going to put in an application. How do you ensure that there's limited? And again, as we say, we are in the learning moment of like, how do we ensure that we reduce the barriers to entry? Because we still recognize that our application forms are in English. That's not everyone's language of understanding. And so that already creates a barrier to entry for people who would want to participate in the space. We also understand that a lot of us are in this particular position where we're able to speak the technical language, and then, not everyone uses the same terminology. So how do we also learn in a way where we take a ground up approach, where we work with communities and actually having a community-centered fund? And that's our vision, our goal at the end of the day, when we think about the low barriers to entry, is how do we design the funding mechanism so that the onus and the power is not just with the funding organization, but it's actually given back to the community. And I think there are other feminist organizations, probably such as Frida and Mama Cash, and the Black Feminist Fund, who have done this extremely well. And there's a lot of lessons that some of us can then take to actually think about, like, how do we meaningfully fund for feminist organizations at the intersection of gender and digital technologies?
Thank you so much, Chennai. That's food for thought. How do we meaningfully fund? Yes, and that's something that we're going to continue thinking through. I just saw a question in the chat room that, or a comment that says that the MOSFEST on the platform is showing that it's completely sold out. So if you want to, if there's something that can be done about that, or you want to respond to that comment, I just wanted to draw your attention to it. Someone is speaking to you and it's saying it's sold out. Yeah. So I think I'm going to ask Caroline this next question, and it's around policy and regulatory landscape. We know that long-term systemic change is going to come from influencing that environment. And what we have also observed is that sometimes there seems to be at least more funding available to service programs than policy advocacy programs. It will seem that funders are quite interested in how is it put outputs and impacts and outcomes that are quantifiable, measurable effects in the short term. What activities did you complete, and how many people, and things like that. Whereas policy is not a short-term game, is a very long-term game that may not show any results for quite a number of years. So, with your background and experience working in both policy advocacy and service programs, and now in a funding organization, do you think that we should be thinking about funding policy interventions, policy engagement more meaningfully, and how can we do that, in ways that actually arrive at impact?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a really valid question. And one thing I can tell you is we can only do so much in terms of programming, and especially if we are not governments. Ideally, service to the people is a responsibility of governments. When aid organizations such as us come into the picture, we basically are coming to bridge the gap, but for a short time. Sustainably, if things are supposed to be done correctly, governments are supposed to be at the forefront. And it's very, very important that even with technology and digital inclusion, government policies should be able to reflect some of the sentiments that we are saying here. And I would start from Give Directly, for example, when we started our work. Back then, it was mostly, let's try and see if this works. And 13 years later, we have 20 randomized control trials that have given us evidence in different levels for how this can be done. And it's very important to know that it doesn't matter how many randomized control trials we do or how many people we reach. We need the government. And that is where we need to influence policies. As Jessica was speaking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and all these satellite imagery that is coming up, one thing came to my mind around the whole question about inclusion, data privacy, and just how people are handling data. And if you're going to talk about digital inclusion of women, we must have very, very sound policies that will, one, speak to their inclusion, and two, speak to their protection. One of the things, if you look at artificial intelligence, machine learning, the people who work on these things, while what we see at the front are technology or, built out solutions, the truth of the matter is there is a human being, and humans have biases, and humans can be corrupted, and humans can waste other humans away. And when you think about those types of solutions, artificial intelligence, machine learning will target people who have already had access to technology. When you think about the women and the women whose lives we want to impact, most of them will not already be in the radar. So solutions that are designed, to reach people using technology, for example, will most likely be leaving out women and girls because they may not know, they may not have the technology, their data may not have been collected to be included in the systematic analysis and machine learning algorithms that helps them to be included in those. That is where we need governments. We need governments to be aware that as we go into using data and technology, there will be more exclusion risks to the most vulnerable. The next thing that is going to be happening is violations of people's rights, privacy, and confidentiality, because harnessing of so much data will be done in the unawareness of the people who are providing that data, who are the data owners. And you can imagine, when a lot of people are thinking about vulnerabilities and people who need help, especially in the aid space, most of those people are going to be women. They may not know what it means to give your name, your phone number, the name of your spouse, the name of your children to people who you've never met. And governments need to have policies that can be able to protect these populations. And our responsibility as development actors is to be able to identify what are the existing policies currently. Does it meet the bar for protecting the people that we are serving? Who is responsible in government to institute the right policies so that when we are doing our work or when another person is doing this work, they're doing it in a safe way? Because you may be doing it in your small way and doing it safely, but the moment it gets viral, technology will be out of our reach. And the people who will suffer most are the women that we're talking about today. So policy is at the core of transforming communities, at transforming lives. Otherwise, we will have solutions that can provide life-changing and transforming, innovations, but which can be misused. And those can only be guarded by sound policies, and not just policies that are also implemented properly. As we say this, Tope, one thing that I'd like to also, emphasize is there is a gap in two ways. One is the evidence. Evidence to influence that policy is very, very important. But one thing that has lately really disturbed me is that policy spaces include the yous and I's, the common faces, people who understand policy, who have worked with these policies all these years. As things change, the things change with us. And the more they change, the more they remain the same. And the reason they remain the same is because the community-based institutions, organizations, the women, the feminist movements at the rural areas, they're not at the table. They don't understand what it is that we are discussing on the policy tables. And I'm going to give you an example. Currently, there is this whole hype about localization, and bringing solutions down to the people who actually own the problems. And the people who are discussing the localization agenda are people who are not local. They don't even know the locations of the local people that they want to localize decisions for. And as they're localizing decisions in DC, in London, in Nairobi, and in Brussels. And at the end of the day, that decision never reaches the woman. So someone is making the decision about harnessing data of a woman in a rural village, say in Uganda, and putting strategies for what technologies, what solutions can solve her problems. You do not know her problems, and worse still, you do not even make her aware that you're going to be part of the solution of her problem. And that, for me, is where the problem is. And we need to be able to do policy influencing to the extent that the people who are affected by these problems are part of the solution, and the solutions are actually responding to needs that they understand. Back to you, Tope.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline. I actually identify with a lot of the conversations you're having, because I work a lot around policy engagement. A lot of the issues you raised, because I also work around policy engagement in Nigeria, and I could make a case all day. So I absolutely identify with many of those issues that you raised. And I'm just going to ask Jessica to take it forward by now speaking more focused, to focus on sustainability as a critical aspect of funding these initiatives. So, we were just talking with Caroline about, how some of the times there are project-based or service-based programs that are being funded. It's just 3 months, it's 6 months. And after that, that's the end. There's no funding to continue to generate evidence, engage stakeholders, influence policy, and empower the organizations that are doing this work to pay salaries that are competitive, so that they can attract the same talent that private sectors can attract, so that they can be institutionalized if they need papers, if they need structure. Those kind of fundings are hardly available, but we find a lot of funding around maybe project-based or service-based programs. And I just really wanted you to speak to that from your experience. I know that Ford has moved into the space of sustainable funding for a few years now. What has worked? Or let's start from, why did Ford make that sort of decision? and what has worked? What are some of maybe like the early successes that you are seeing in terms of just keeping those organizations empowered and advancing in the work that they're doing, either around digital rights or digital inclusion?
Sure. I mean, there's again, a more general point here and then one about the gender and tech conversation. So what I would say is that in broad view, sustainability is about having a vision of both the what and then thinking about how. So on the what, I mean, in the ways that we fund in tech, the Tech and Society strategy is an ecosystemic strategy. So it's saying that if we're going to transform the digital domain, it needs to be a transformation that hits on multiple nodes, because in real terms, it's an ecosystem. There isn't one type of approach or one type of intervention or one type of entity that's going to make a change. Actually, the digital ecosystem is made up of lots of different kinds of entities, including government entities, including knowledge producers, right, as well as advocacy groups, right? There's a lot of different actors and donors. So I think the first thing that's important if we want to have a sustainability approach is to actually map the terrain. What are we talking about as an ecosystem? Who is involved? And then, of course, as donors, we pick the pieces of the ecosystem we can support, because not every donor funds into everything, and that's fine. I actually don't think that donors should spread themselves all over trying to do everything if it's not their speciality. For example, with the Ford Foundation, we give reasonably large grants. Part of the reason is that if you want to give very, very small grants, you need a staff base, right, that is going to be able to do all of the accompaniment and the extra support that is needed to fund initiatives that are small in scale, that perhaps don't have a lot of institutional infrastructure. So to solve for that, what we do is we fund medium to larger entities. And then for the smaller entities, we fund funds that fund them. Right. So, for example, Ford Foundation was a seed funded to the Numun Fund, which is the first, majority world global South feminist tech fund. We fund women's funds, right? We fund other initiatives that are, again, then able to grant on resources with the addition of support, that is required, again, for the kinds of entities and the kinds of interventions that they're funding. So map the ecosystem, but then also understand your role and really where your added value or where your kind of your contribution is. Because like I said, I really don't think all donors can do all things at all times. I just think it's not really a strategy for success, but of course, then be in conversation with others, right? And so we do a lot of collaborative grant making, and we're in a lot of conversations with other donors in the space. And like I said, also with these entities that are able to then support on the Black Feminist Fund and others, we're able to support and to fund different kinds of work that, we're not necessarily well built for. So the second is the how. And I mean, for years, we know from the field that everybody has been saying project-based funding, which really was the outcome of bilateral approaches, for a reason, to be fair, because bilaterals have a very different kind of accountability pressure based on the fact that their funding comes from taxation of citizens. And so they're open to constant scrutiny from those citizens as to what their money is doing, and they need to be able to account for it, in detail sometimes. And so the kind of it's something that we rarely talk about, but like the reason behind it is not totally just a lack of trust in the demographic. It's partly about the pressure that comes from the source of the money. So in many ways, money that is freer, right? Money from endowed philanthropy, money that's been leveraged that can then take assurances on behalf of its back donors and then help to fund in freer ways, I think has a responsibility to think about what do we do to resource in a manner that enables other things. So the Ford Foundation, particularly under the current president, Darren Walker, has been very committed to this idea of, if we're going to fund in a manner that changes and in a manner that's long-term and that is transformative, surely we need to be funding the core of the organizations. The BUILD program is probably the most exemplary kind of manifestation of that. It's now a multi-billion-dollar investment that was, 5-year fully flexible funding to organizations with very minimal requirements, apart from doing an organizational assessment that just basically is a conversation starter for the whole organization so that people can identify actually where are the needs, and on the basis of that develop a strategy for how they would want to then invest the remaining 4 years. There was an evaluation of the first round, and actually it proved to be wildly successful. Right, a majority of them, in a vast majority, like in the 90% of organizations actually were managed to increase the impact on mission, right, by making these investments that people deem sometimes to be luxurious, right, investing in the overhead, in the governance, in the staffing, in the resourcing mechanisms. A lot of organizations, particularly in East Africa, focused on financial independence and how to build up a financial resilience to decrease donor dependency. So it's also interesting to see what people choose to invest in. But in general, in Ford's approach, I mean, based on that kind of general ethos, we do, wherever possible, seek to provide core or general support. And to give multi-year grants. And when a project grant, it's when we can only award a project grant, and that's really because of legal criteria. You know, if organizations are not 501c3 compliant and all the rest, because funding is guided by law, and so we have to follow the law. What we do is we really are part of a donor movement around true cost recovery. And so trying to make sure that, again, we're fairly compensating for the admin and overheads in a project. So I think that even in the project universe, there could be more consideration. A lot of donors would give, say, a maximum of 11%, 12%. When I was at the African Women's Development Fund, we did an experiment with Leading from the South. When we put out the first call, it was AWDF had significantly increased the amounts of money that it could give, size of grants. And we put out a call and we didn't specify a limitation on overhead. Without fault, almost every applicant applied with a maximum of 12% overhead. Whereas they could have given out, requested 50%. I mean, everybody self-centered and basically said around 11 to 12. My experience also as a donor is when you ask people to provide a core budget, people don't know how to do it because they've never actually been able to put together all of their organization into one spreadsheet and just work out, right, what does it actually look like to run this thing in general as a composite, because of the pressure towards project-based funding. So I feel like there's lots of things that actually need to change in the ecosystem if we're going to get to balance with this whole idea of core and multi-year. It's not just donors, it's actually also organizations seeking funding who need to move to a place where they're thinking about what does it actually mean to fully recover for our costs? What would a reasonable salary scale look like? What would it look like to have, proper benefits for staff? I've worked in many organizations which are women's rights organizations that don't even have adequate maternity leave because they can't afford it. So they'll do the statutory African, which tends to be like 3 to 3 months, right? Which is insufficient, right? You're supposed to breastfeed up to 6 months. That's interrupting, It's like, it's not actually viable as maternity leave, but because organizations can't actually pay for it. So I think it's also an exercise for institutions seeking funding to do a piece of work around imagining what would an organization that was run in the manner which we would love to run it, which fully complies with, again, the visions of social justice and labor rights and all of that, what would it look like and how much would that cost, and be able to resource it. So all I would say to other donors in the sector, like I said, is to the extent that you can, continue to push, right, for this idea of true cost recovery, for thinking, enabling and finding ways to support organizations to think about what would it look like to build out an annual budget, right? Or even a multi-year budget that actually imagines that we would have consistent resources to be able to fund everything sufficiently, including our overhead and admin and human resources. And then to think about raising the bar when it comes to the percentage admin if people are not able to give core and multi-year. And like I said, I understand that, there are different sources of money have different pressures behind it. But I do think that there is a lot of money out there that's really flexible. The other thing I would say is that I think for fundraising organizations to try and work out, it's a lot of labor, but to just try and work out what are independent revenue streams that you can generate? To what extent is the public willing to give to you, for example? Any of that kind of resourcing is actually the most flexible money you'll ever get. And so is there a way to think about, creating in ways that actually make the work more sustainable? And a last thing to say is that I think this is critical for many of our countries and moving into upper middle income status. When you move to upper middle income status, it means that you are no longer a DAC recipient country. If your country is no longer eligible for development assistance, it means that a lot of the money that is available in the system is going to go away. And I really don't hear a lot of conversation happening in those countries around that. But I think it's really important to begin to think about it. If you become upper middle income, it means that there's more money circulating in your country. Now, we know that there's an issue of inequality within. So you can have countries that on paper have really big GDP, and yet there's a lot of majority very poor people. We know that, okay? But it does mean that the corporate sector is getting richer. And so again, what are they doing about giving back? And it also means that there are more people we would classify as middle class, although some of the measures are a bit problematic in terms of the amounts they consider middle class. But anyway, there are more people with disposable income. Right. And so to think about what does that mean in terms of the ways that we're thinking about resourcing and financing.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a full discourse, and I've taken some notes for myself as well. I will not be able to dig that as much as I like. We are almost at the end of this conversation, and I'd like to give room for a few questions. Thankfully, I can see that Caroline is engaging with questions that have been asked directly to her in the chat. There's a general question there. It's quite general. This person is asked, they mentioned what they do and then asked about how they can raise funds for their initiative, which is around accountability and good governance, I think. And then they were asking how to raise funds. And I think that that's quite general. And some of that, maybe a lot of that, have already been answered. So if we have other people who may have questions, now is the time to ask. And I will ask the speakers to do the miracle of 1 minute answer if possible. Let's see if we can take you can I think you can raise your hand and then we will unmute you. You can also type in the chat if you feel more comfortable. I'll just take the first 3 questions that I get, and then we see how far we can go with that. Okay, there's Peter. I can see Peter. Peter Winnie.
Yes, Peter Winnie.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
30 seconds. Thank you.
Okay, this is Peter Winnie from Kenya, Kisumu, founder of United Destiny Shepherds CBO within the informal settlements of Kisumu. I'm just finding it interesting to be in this platform because the insight is very, whatever is the topic discussed is really bringing out the reality on how things have been happening. And now my question goes that, how therefore do we assist? Because localizing and how localizing the approaches. And we are, as we have said, majority of these agendas are discussed by people who are never even on the ground themselves. And it's really hurting when you find a lot of discussion going on, but no effective implementation or rolling back of the same at the grassroots level. The majority are still not aware of the discussion going on at all. So how and the funding, my question now on the funding to localized local organization or grassroots organization that has attempted to apply any grant. Maybe their level of operations are more effective at the grassroots, but they lack how to consolidate things and put things in proper manner that they can convince a donor to support their initiatives. Because you look at it, mostly they ask for maybe big bank statements, maybe what you had implemented before, the project you have implemented before, so that you can be convinced that you have the capacity to implement. But you can't be having the capacity without starting from somewhere. So how do you get, like the experience in Kenya, we talk about when you get you want to get employment. Yeah.
I'm sorry, your 1 minute is up and I'm going to have to stop you, but I think that's a robust question that is well understood. So I will ask the speakers to respond to that. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just going to ask this. I'm going to read this out that we have in the chat because it's very similar to what he's asking, and I'll just ask the speakers to respond, to both questions in one breath. This person says, how can funders leverage tech and ICTs in regard to funding where you have mainstream NGOs competing with grassroots women's movements? How do you make sure grassroots feminist collectives are reached, given their disadvantaged position in terms of access to information about funders? So I think it's related to what Peter was asking about how you reach, grassroots organizations that do not have this information, that are not usually aware about this kind of communication and initiatives, and they have a lot of barriers to deal with in terms of documentation and how they put themselves forward to meet the criteria for funding. So I think it's very related questions. So Chennai, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Tope. So to bring it into thinking about the work around gender and tech, right, in terms of thinking about funding, competition with grassroots movements and established non-governmental organizations, I think the emphasis around technology as something that Jessica said, that it's nascent and it's new. And there's the example that Caroline was sharing around like going to rural communities and providing them with mobile devices. The thing around resourcing is really around collaborative work. At the end of the day, it is important for those who do have the capacity, who've been in the fundraising game, to actually structure the way that they work with grassroots movements. I've seen quite a few funding organizations now asking for, if three organizations are doing similar work, asking for those organizations to collaborate to actually come up with something that is going to be more impactful than to simply fuel the competition that exists. And I think with technology, for us to actually rebut what is existent in terms of like where the tech is being built, it's not being built by people who look like us, nor is it being built with us as active knowledge producers of the technology. It's really around that collaboration where people who are technologists collaborate with people who are grassroots, who work in the grassroots movements, who actually can have the level of impact that's needed, to the people who are traditional non-governmental organizations that have had access to policy-making spaces and carry that credibility. So I think it's really important for us to frame this conversation around like funding as a resourcing and accompaniment perspective, and also really thinking about an overall strategy of how do we shift the way in which the current technology is being built and the way that it does have an impact from a gender perspective, to really thinking about it as a collaborative intervention that brings in different people, the different skill sets that they have, to actually pull together either a funding proposal or a business model that results in new technology that is built that actually is responsive to the reality of African marginalized groups along gender, which is women, also on sexuality, and diverse people, so that there is that understanding of like, how do we make sure that the technology that's being built does have a positive impact when it comes to gendered issues on the African continent.
Thank you so much, Chennai. Caroline, your thoughts on those two questions?
Sorry, thank you. It is a reality. It's a reality that small organizations have more challenges in accessing resources than big organizations, and how much so in a space where technology and digital innovations are being used, and those same small organizations do not have access to those capabilities. I think where I would come from, and responding to the participants who've asked that question, is we have to be able to act from a demand perspective and also from a supply perspective. And putting reality, I have interacted with both local organizations and also funding institutions, and there's deficit in both sides. Number one, local organizations need to invest in getting information and knowledge, and technology has opened that space more than ever before. If you worked in this space 2 decades ago, getting information on funding was way, way harder than it is today. Right now, you can access online platforms on the internet and do your researches to be able to understand where is funding sitting. Make yourself known and available. Get yourself closer to the people who are already doing good work and let them know your interest in collaborating with them. I also think that donors need to be very, very intentional in the people that they want to fund and how they want to deliver those fundings. Because I think big organizations have they've made themselves a shortcut to donors so that donors see them faster than they do local organizations. And there is every opportunity for donors to be more intentional about building capacity at the local level, both in terms of availing information for people who should know what is going on, but also making intentional decisions for bigger players in the field to create partnership opportunities with local organizations. That said, it's very, very important that local organizations take advantage of innovations, especially innovations in technology. How do you get yourself closer to using some of the technologies that are available that will bring you closer to the conversations around inclusion at an organizational level, rather than, just doing the normal day-to-day community-based interventions? Explore, innovate, ask yourself questions, and also showcase that you have the potential to actually be a part of the solution.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. Do we have okay, I'm trying to see if there are any more questions in the chat, or are there any other persons that want to ask questions? Okay, so if there are no more, I can't see any answers and no further questions in the chat. I think I'm going to.
I have shared something on WhatsApp, on the chat box anyway.
Yeah. I can see that, and thank you for that contribution to the conversation that is ongoing. Yeah. Specifically, I think Chennai already spoke to this, especially in the beginning of our conversation about the bottom-up approach. So thank you so much for that contribution. I wanted to start with Jessica, just winding down and thinking about the challenges and opportunity that this space presents, for African philosophies, for foundations, for organizations that are really doing the work around gender justice and digital technologies. What do you think that the challenges are from your experience, and where do you think the opportunities are?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is pace. The thing about tech is that there's a lot that's already under development. So, for example, by the time we're seeing ChatGPT, it's actually been in development for years before. And so very often, again, we're kind of trying to catch up with things that are already well on the way and well, spread around the world. So I feel like there's a question of pace. And if we're working in tech, we really need to skill up ourselves and become more knowledgeable actually about what we're dealing with. I think we need to have more relationships with technologists and people who are actually in the space of developing new tech to basically also understand what's coming, what's sort of ahead of the curve, and to do values clarification. I think we need to have and kind of strengthen a sense of common ethics around what we're trying to do. It's very interesting for me when you hear some of the founders of this, like, the people who created the World Wide Web, for example, actually filled with angst about what's become of it, because from their vantage point, they didn't offer to the world something that would turn into a tool for violence and exclusion, right, and sort of enabling harm. Or solely enabling profit, right? The idea was that this offering to the world was supposed to be something that was about enabling communication, greater connection between people, a means of sharing knowledge. So I think we're sort of a little bit out of kilter. And I think we need to, like I said, to deal with the question of pace. and also to deal with the question of our own knowledge, and to really like skill up and kind of get a sense of what's coming ahead. In a way, that's also an opportunity, because I feel like there are people engaged in that, and there are also people engaged in the process of really developing kind of ethics and visions for where we are. And we can, as donors, we can do that through exploratory funding. For example, at the moment, we have a grant with Policy, which is a feminist internet organization based in Uganda, but with people all over the continent, looking at what are the gendered implications of AI for work. Right? Because what we've seen is that, you know, the African region, and the East Africa in particular, is called the Silicon Savannah. We know it's not just Kenya now. Zanzibar is also becoming a real hub. There's an interest in the African region, but as almost in the same manner with which our minerals are seen, which is like as a source, right? It's like a deposit, right? Rather than thinking about, you know, and as a source of cheap labor. So we have a lot of, you know, advocacy at the moment that's saying, wait a minute, you know, actually, if we're going to be workers in this digital future, we also need rights, right? We also need provisions around how this happens so that we're protected, right? The same with our intellectual property. So I feel like there's a lot of interesting work that can happen there, but I think we need to lean into more exploratory work, into sort of exploring and learning for ourselves and dealing with this question of pace. I do actually think that giving more flexible money helps with pace, because if we resource organizations to be able to adapt and to respond quickly, right, to have infrastructure that is flexible, because they're not just bound to kind of projects, it would help with the pace question. And that goes again back a little bit to what I was saying about how Ford funds. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential. The last thing I would just say is, if you look at the kind of ethical vision of what an amazing internet would look like, as written by African feminists, I think you actually get a vision of the internet that would work for all. What we know in any context, in any sector, is that if you solve for the most oppressed, if you solve for the most marginalized, you've solved for everybody, right? You've solved for everybody. So I think if we begin to shift our focus in terms of how, you know, whose voice we're listening to, I think it's going to be crucial in terms of building a digital environment that is just and that works for everyone.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I like the point you made around how if we're not doing enough exploratory work that upskills us and allows us to see around the curve in terms of what's upcoming, we will always be behind in every aspect of the conversation, you know, whether that's with regard to funding or policy or other types of works that we may be doing to advance rights in the digital environment for the most vulnerable. I'm going to ask the same question to Chenai and Caroline. Caroline, you can go first. What do you see as the challenges, the opportunities in the space, and what do you think that we should be doing next?
Sure. I think one of the biggest awareness that we need to have in Africa and for African philanthropists and foundations is the reality that while globally women are behind men by 9% in terms of digital inclusion, in Africa we're lagging at 25% behind men, and we can't close our ears to that. And that basically tells us that as the world is gaining ground, Africa is still behind. And if we are thinking about changing the realities of our being here, then we have to address those percentages. The next other thing is the reality about the increasing numbers of people living in extreme poverty. Now we are talking about 650 million people. Those 650 million people, most of them are living in Africa. Which means if we are going to be talking about the unfairness that is happening in aid, most of it is going to be affecting people living in this continent. And it's time for philanthropists and foundations to be able to invest in understanding the depths of what is lacking in this space so that we can be on the table to discuss. When we are talking about solutions for Africa, can we be able to curate those solutions here, resource the process of curating solutions so that when we get into global platforms, we are able to get into conversations with people from a position of knowing and understanding where the continent is coming from. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is in technology. if we are going to do technology the right way, I think mobile phone access has given us a really good example of what we can do in terms of leapfrogging technology. Like we have said, the pace has to increase, as Jessica has said. But if you think about, for example, the solutions that are now being put to address some of the biggest challenges in the world, it is mostly emphasizing on efficiency, speed, and scale. If you're going to hit any of those three, technology is going to be the solution. Right now, the people who are driving those technology solutions are out of Africa. What does that mean for us? When we bring machine learning and artificial intelligence to harness data from Africa, what is the impact on the people living in this continent? And how can we make sure that philanthropy and donations or resourcing in this continent is helping us to catch up? And is there a way in which we can be able to leapfrog and be able to be at the table discussing with the Googles and the Metas when they're building solutions for people living in this continent? I think that there is a lot of opportunity for us, but there are also a lot of challenges. And there is every possibility that we can move the needle. One thing that we can't live here without talking about is the challenges that women are facing with climate change and how the conversation on climate financing, resilience, response, adaptation is all being held globally. It is taking center stage. Yet when you look at our continent today, there's a lot that is happening to us. Africa is bearing a lot of the brunt of climate change, and not just Africa. Women are the ones who suffer most. They're the ones who are running around with their children when floods strike. When there is famine, they're the ones who are stressing about nutrition. When houses are destroyed, it is the women who are scampering to go and look for places to go live with their children because there's been a mudslide or a cyclone. How does philanthropy in Africa start, setting the agenda in the climate conversations that are going on globally and to the lead up to COP 2028? And how do we make sure that inclusion of women in terms of digital solutions that can help them catch up with some of these adaptation and responses to climate change can be a part of the bigger picture of how we help women live their best lives and their best forms while they're still humans in this earth?
Thank you, Caroline. And I should apologize. We are now 3 minutes past the time. I will ask for an additional 2 minutes only, or maybe less, because I just wanted Chennai to also pitch in, and then we'll end the conversation. So thank you for your patience, and thank you for not logging out. Chennai.
Thank you, Tope. So I in addition to all of the wonderful things that my fellow panelists have said, I would like to end on this note of one of the questions that we didn't ask, and I think is important when we think about the challenges and opportunities of tech and gender issues, is really why. Why technology as a solution, for us to unpack for how it will work and to what end. And I think while it's important to also leapfrog and to also connect to those things, but it's also important to create friction in order for us to stop and really think about, like, do we need to go at that pace or do we need to slow down? We've seen policies like a lot of governments who've adopted, if it's not internet for all, it's AI for all, it's always A for all. But to what ends at that pace of trying to then always be trying to adapt and to connect to whatever everyone else has done. So I really think it's important for us to create friction and slow down. And also because rest is a feminist praxis. So in this moment, we can also rest and think about the technology that we're making use of. And I think it will be important for philanthropists in this space as they think about gender and at the intersection of tech and gender to really move from a position of reacting to actually responding to realities, because we've seen a lot of the top-down philanthropist interventions have been as a reaction to an upcoming reality, but they are not responding to consistent and existent reality. So at the end of the day, we have conversations that miss out on thinking about labor issues, which have been a consistent thing in the African economy, climate issues, which have been a consistent thing, having a major impact on women and marginalized groups. So those would be my last interventions for us to have this moment where we think about friction to slow down things and to move from a position of reacting, but to actually responding to the reality and context that we exist in when it comes to funding around tech and gender.
Thank you so much, Chennai. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much, Caroline. This is a conversation we could have had all day. I think this has been really insightful. I'd like to thank Mosun and the team for putting this conversation together. And thank you everyone who has been engaging in the chat room, asking questions directly to us. It's been a very insightful afternoon, I think, and I'd like to thank you very much for your time and bring this conversation officially to an end on this platform, but I think that we can continue to engage in one way or other. Thank you so much.